As we're waiting for everyone and we're seeing this participant number jump up, I just have to say how exciting it is. We can see over 303 people registered for this evening's event. And if we were all able to sit together in one of our Mercer Island venues, we would be able to see, I'm sure, a lot of familiar faces and maybe some new ones. But we have, as of right now, 189 people that have already logged on. So for those of you who are logging on, we're just going to give another minute or so, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we are right at 7:02, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I'm Jennifer Guerrero Flood, and I'm serving as moderator of tonight's event, Towards Inclusive Community. And I live on Mercer Island with my family. I also work here and throughout King County as a realtor. I've worked in various capacities in social justice, education, and real estate for the past 25 years. And tonight's topic is something I think about every single day in my work. So I'm just so excited to see the fantastic turnout for this community conversation. And as I said, over 300 people registered as of this morning. So with that, welcome to the first event in a series of conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sponsored by the City of Mercer Island and presented by 1MI and Do the Work MI. Tonight's event is particularly special because it's co-organized by the MIHS Black Student Union and the Straum Jewish Community Center, and is enriched by the participation of student researchers from the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project and realtors from John L. Scott, who are working to identify and address racist housing covenants. Thank you to the Mercer Island City Council, which voted to support these conversations for our community, and a special thanks to former Mayor Benson Wong for both his years of service to Mercer Island and his leadership during the creation of this series. Thank you, Benson, for your commitment to making our community a place where all Islanders feel welcome. So before we begin, the organizers have asked me to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. So first, I'd like to introduce you to some guiding principles or session norms that will be followed throughout the series. This is a safe and respectful learning environment where we lean into discomfort and embrace paradox. We seek thoughtful engagement and community connection, not perfection. Second, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A box. They will go directly to a moderating team who will aggregate the questions and then share with me during our 2 Q&A sessions. One will happen around the 30-minute mark, and then a second will happen at the end of the final presentation. Please note, your questions will not be visible to other audience members or be answered in real time. Hopefully, we can do an in-person event soon that will allow for greater audience engagement. If your question doesn't get answered, please look for a forthcoming Let's Talk MI page about this event where we can continue tonight's conversation. Finally, there are 2 quick polls we will be sharing just before the final Q&A near the end of the program. Your participation in these polls will provide us feedback as we move forward with this series and help ensure we are achieving our goal of building community through inclusive conversations. We value your input. Let's get started. So tonight, we have a special guest to open the evening. I believe Claudia Balducci. Yes, wonderful, you are here. I'm looking at all of the faces. So Claudia Balducci is chair of the King County Council. Council member Balducci is a mom, a transportation and affordable housing leader, and a former public safety official. Council member?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone. This is so exciting to be here tonight. I need to extend official thanks to the City of Mercer Island, the Mercer Island High School Black Student Union, Strong Jewish Community Center, One Mercer Island, and Do the Work Mercer Island for this great evening and the invitation for me to say a few words of greeting tonight. One of the reasons it's so exciting to me to see the community come together and with students around this issue is we have spent a lot of time at King County looking at the causes of some of our housing issues around King County. And there's a great disparity in our county, a great division of where people can afford to live and how that impacts people of color and immigrants, and there's a lot of inequality that shows up in our data. And in 2017, I helped to start off a task force work that we did for a number of years at King County. And we studied a lot of the causes and results and solutions to some of our housing challenges. And we looked at some of the issues you're going to talk about tonight. We have a housing shortage in this region, but we also have housing inequity in this region. And you are about to dive into one of the reasons historically why that was created, but the tendrils of those historical decisions in covenants and lots of other policy areas persist to today. Housing instability and housing insecurity hits our communities of color particularly hard. So I'm just so excited that you're doing this tonight. I think it's really important work. If you find that you are really moved by what you talk about when you're talking about the impact of racially restrictive covenants in private transactions, I want to recommend to you a book, if you haven't read it, called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. It is very eye-opening about the ways in which policies that persist to today continue to have harmful impacts to our community. And this is how we start to undo those harmful impacts. So thank you so much for doing this. I look forward to the discussion tonight. I'm going to be listening here on my headphones in my kitchen. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Jennifer, so much for inviting me.
Right. Well, thank you, Councilmember Balducci, for taking the time to join us, and also for representing us, and for the most perfect kind of segue, because The Color of Law was actually the book that inspired so much of the work that the community organizations on Mercer Island are doing, as well as many of the people who are presenting tonight. So thank you again. So next, I would like to introduce one of the organizers of tonight's conversation, the MIHS BSU. The Black Student Union is a club organized to give a voice to the Black and Brown students of Mercer Island High School. It is composed of 30 students, including 7 who identify as Black or African American, 4 biracial students, and 9 white students. Members of the MIHS BSU here this evening include Ella Simpson, president of the BSU, Brooks Kasai, BSU Public Relations, and BSU member Luke Harp. Here to speak on their behalf is Cole Drayton, Vice President of the MIHS BSU.
So my name is Cole Drayton. I'm a senior at Mercer Island High School and the Vice President of the Black Student Union. And I am one of the 24 students who identify as either Black or African American at Mercer Island High School. And we're just honored to be able to be here and work with the MI community, 1MI, and the SJCC to bring awareness to the segregation and the racial covenants of Mercer Island. And we just hope this can be like one of the first steps to help make Mercer Island a truly inclusive environment for all people who live here. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Cole, for being here and for presenting. So now I'd like to introduce our first presenters for the night, project researchers from the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project. So I'll let you all take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Jaslyn Woods, and I'm a research associate for the University of Washington's Racial Restrictive Covenant Project. And I'm here with my colleagues, Sophia Dowling and Nicholas Boren. So Sophia Dowling, she's also a research associate with the project, and Nicholas is an IT research associate for the project. And tonight we're gonna begin the presentation by explaining the history of housing discrimination and segregation in the United States. And then we'll move into focusing more on King County and that housing discrimination in King County, and the use of racially restrictive covenants. And then we will talk about our project and how we're finding these restrictions in the property records. And then we'll end by talking about the lasting legacy of these practices and what community members and homeowners can do to help.
Hi, everyone. I am Sophia. Thank you for coming. So a lot of what we will be talking about today is the systemic efforts that prohibited people of color from accumulating wealth in America. And a really important part of this discussion is the establishment of the idea of home ownership as a symbol of patriotism, citizenship, and civic duty. So In 1917, the Wilson administration and the Federal Department of Labor created a campaign titled Own Your Own Home. They distributed pamphlets to children in school and really encouraged the idea of homeownership as a citizen's duty. And in 1921, Warren G. Harding and Herbert Hoover created an exclusionary zoning campaign and formed the Better Homes in America organization, where they encouraged the building of single-family homes and used the white nuclear family as an idealistic version of what everyone in America should assimilate to. They encouraged suburbanization and encouraged restricted and segregated living. So during the New Deal era, which paralleled the era of private restriction that we'll be talking about today, the federal government started several different racially restrictive housing efforts, including racialized public housing, the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the Federal Housing Administration. The HOLC was created in 1933 under FDR's New Deal to rescue people who were on the brink of foreclosure during the Great Depression, and it was a federal program. So they purchased existing mortgages and issued new mortgages. Prior to the HOLC, banks usually required a very significant down payment and full repayment within 10 years, but they expanded access to homeownership by allowing banks to offer loans which required no more than 10% down and expanded the repayment era to 20 or 30 years, which is really similar to what we have now. But in an effort to make sure that they would receive their loan payments, they created maps of every metropolitan area in the country, over 150 maps. And they weren't just curious about the condition of the homes, but they were really looking at the racial composition of the neighborhoods. So they created these maps, redlined maps as we call them. Here is an example of Seattle. This map was created in 1936. And the color coding directly corresponds to the racial composition of neighborhoods. The green refers to best and blue still desirable, and the red was deemed hazardous solely based on the presence of people of color in the neighborhood. And like the HOLC, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, which also played a critical role in the institutionalization of racism. And the FHA insured bank mortgages that covered 80% of purchase price, and they worked directly with banks and loan corporations to insure their loans, but would refuse to insure any loans in racially mixed neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were predominantly people of color. To make sure that the loan was at low risk of defaulting, they used the maps created by the HOLC and surveyed homes and neighborhoods to make sure that it was white only, because they believed that loans would be at a much higher risk in racially mixed neighborhoods. And then in 1935, they created the underwriting manual to help appraisers look at neighborhoods, which explicitly opposed loaning to racially mixed neighborhoods. There's a little quote there on the screen, which is very explicit. And the role of the real estate industry was also very important in this segregation. So the efforts of the federal government were simultaneously paralleling efforts by real estate companies, loan companies, banks, mortgage companies across the country. And until 1950, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had a clause in their code of ethics against selling homes to a person of color because it would be destructive to the property values of the home. And this is really significant because most banks, loan companies, title companies, insurance companies, and real estate men were closely affiliated with the real estate board and upheld their code of ethics. So almost all of the real estate men in Seattle were members of the National Association, and often they were really prominent members, and so they upheld their code of ethics here.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. So did you want, were we going to pause there and take a moment to check on you? We're going to keep going. Keep going. All right.
So now we're going to transition from focusing on this racial segregation at the federal national level to focusing more on King County and Seattle. So Seattle has a long history of racial discrimination and segregation. For many generations, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans were shut out of neighborhoods, schools, many occupations, and sometimes stores and restaurants. And Seattle and King County still show that the effects of that history today. And the map on the right of the slide shows where Black people in the 1960s in Seattle lived. And as you can see, they were quite strictly confined to the CD, even in 1960 after the covenants were no longer legally enforceable, showing like the lasting legacy of these practices. And so to kind of frame where we're going, I want to briefly compare Seattle segregation to Southern segregation. So in most Southern states, segregation of things like schools, restaurants, and public facilities were required by law. That was not the case in Washington state, but nevertheless, Seattle segregation practices extended well beyond housing. And as you can see from the image down below, this is a picture of Coon Chicken Inn, which stood in Lake City until the 1950s. And just through the symbol of the restaurant and its logo, you can see how it's clearly very racist and towards African Americans. And to go one step further, patrons had to enter the restaurant through the mouth of the man. And as you can see, this clearly shows the extent to which racism and racial discrimination in King County was not subtle. It was very explicit. And this was just one of the beacons of bigotry in the Seattle area. Oh, Sophia, you skipped one slide. Okay, so early residential segregation. In the late 1800s, Indigenous Americans were banned from the city of Seattle, despite the fact that Seattle is located on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Chinese people were also driven out of Seattle in 1886, and those that returned were expected to live in Chinatown or work as servants in the homes of wealthy whites. Similarly, Japanese folks were forced into the same tight neighborhood, and the maps on the left show Chinese and Japanese populations in 1920. And as you can see, for the most part, Chinese and Japanese people were restricted to the Chinatown area. And so just to be clear, segregation was not voluntary until it became illegal in 1968. Most developers, realtors, neighborhood associations, and white residents practiced active racial discrimination. Most neighborhoods in Seattle and the suburbs were designated as restricted in real estate ads. And many neighborhoods were restricted as a matter of law by racial restrictive covenants written into property records. And restrictive covenants are agreements entered into, well, racial restrictive covenants are agreements entered into by a group of property owners, subdivision developers, or real estate operators in a given neighborhood, which legally binds them to not sell, lease, or rent their property to specified groups on the basis of race, creed, religion, or color for a definite and sometimes indefinite period of time. And these restrictions were legally binding on the current as well as future owners. So in addition to people of color being restricted in where they're allowed to live, Black people in particular were also restricted in where they were allowed to exist in King County area after work. So until the late 1960s, Seattle police enforced informal sundown rules. In the evenings after work, African Americans were not supposed to be in white neighborhoods. Black men in particular would be stopped and questioned. Anywhere north of the Ship Canal was considered a sundown zone, also Queen Anne, Magnolia, and West Seattle. And police in the suburbs on the east side and north of Seattle in places like Bothell and Shoreline, police there were even more aggressive. And so these sundown zones highlight the social enforcement that often accompanied residential racial segregation through restrictive covenants written into law, but also sometimes these practices of social enforcement, they were used instead of the restrictive covenants written into law.
So now we're going to transition into talking a little bit about the research that we do. So this project began in 2005, but was unable to be completed because there was not enough funding. However, last year legislation was passed and signed in March 2021 to fund this project, and we have been tasked with identifying racist deeds and deed restrictions and covenants. So to date, we have identified 20,000 restricted properties in King County, and the work will be continued in other counties across the state as well. Here, this map is a map of the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project map. And we also, the red circles indicate the restrictions and deeds, and the yellow indicate restrictions advertised in newspapers. We are still in the process of finding restrictions, and so this database is not complete, and it will unfortunately grow. If you want to explore this map and see the complete list of restrictions, you can go to the Segregated Seattle website. And as you can see, there are not very many restrictions for Mercer Island. There are a lot more to add, and we still have tens of thousands of documents to look through, so the list will continue to grow.
So now we're going to go through a couple of types of documents that we as researchers have to look through in order to find these racial restrictions. And one of them is a plat map. And so a plat map is a map of a land area, and it shows how a tract of land is divided. And this particular plat map is from Fabens Point Waterfront Tracts, a restricted subdivision on Mercer Island. And so as you can see on the left, it shows like the visual map of the subdivision and how the property has been divided into lots. And then on the right has other useful information, but what's particularly useful is that this plat specifically has a restriction section, and not all plats do have a restriction section, but this one does. And it says, if you want to go to the next slide, in the third bullet point, that the property can only be sold, leased, or occupied by people of the white or Caucasian race, and it can only, any person that is not of the white or Caucasian race, they can only occupy the property if they're serving as a domestic servant. And plats are also useful because they're the only way to really know how large a subdivision is in terms of like the amount of parcels or like the amount of property is in that subdivision. So it allows you to see the scale at which people were restricting.
So this is an example of a deed with a restriction, and a deed is a document that signifies the transfer of a property from one person to another. You can see it says Seattle Title Trust Company to Albert Winter in the corner. So they're selling to one person, and this one has a restriction as well.
Petitions are another type of document that we have to look through to find these restrictions. And petitions are interesting because petitions are declarations of covenants used when a neighborhood and the homeowners in that neighborhood have bought homes that weren't restricted, but have later decided that they want them to be restricted. So they come together after they've already bought their homes to restrict their homes after the fact. And so this is a Capitol Hill petition. As you can see, there's just a grantor at the top. They're not selling their property to anybody. And the racial restrictions in the second paragraph. And then if you look at the second page along with the bottom of the first page, it's basically split into two columns. So on the left, that's all the property that's being restricted. And on the right, that's the owners of said property that the name is next to. And so a prominent example of an instance where petitions were heavily used is the Capitol Hill campaign that began in 1927 when homeowners banded together, and with the signatures of 964 homeowners, in 3 years, they were able to restrict 958 lots of property from Black people specifically.
So this is a CC&R, which stands for Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, which are restrictions and rules for living in a certain area that are applied to an entire subdivision rather than a single property. So all of these documents we have showed you are located in books and city records. And looking for these documents is an incredibly tedious process. And before Nicholas joined the project, we were doing it all by hand, but Nicholas has developed code to really expedite the process, which has been wonderful.
Yeah, so not to bore you guys to sleep, so I'll try to go through this as simple as I can. But going through these millions of deeds would take years. Like, I did the math, it would take way too long. So using OCR technology, which is the technology that just allows you to Control F or Command F to find something in your document, using this technology, I have been able to bring down this search process to like 2.5 seconds per file. And then the cool thing about this is, if there's anyone in the audience who's a developer, we're planning on making this project open source in the near future, where anyone can develop and like add to the code, and then anyone can use the code. So that is a great thing to come.
So now I thought it would be interesting to look at some of the language used in these restrictive exclusions and restrictive covenants. So as you can see, properties and subdivisions were restricted to those. An example of this in like Washington Garden Tracts on the east side, to those only of the Aryan race. And this is interesting because this was made after the World War II in 1946. And then if we keep going down the list, properties were also restricted to those only of the white or Caucasian race, and they made sure to exclude what they called Semites, and which they referring to Jewish people. And then property owners, developers, homeowner associations, they also made sure to exclude anyone that was African, Japanese, Chinese, or anyone of the Mongolian descent. And then in the last one, they make sure to exclude people that are Hebrew, and here they're referring to Jewish people, Ethiopian, and here they're referring to Black people, not necessarily African immigrants because they weren't really in this area at the time, Malay, Filipino people, and then Asian people. And they also used words like Negro and Negro blood to refer to Black people, but that's just not an example, one of the examples that I picked for this. And this all just goes to show the extent to which people of color and Jewish people in the Seattle area were restricted to out of thousands of properties. And an example of a prominent Seattle resident that often bought and restricted subdivisions was William Boeing, the founder of Boeing Aircraft. He purchased large tracts of land in what is now Northwest Seattle and Shoreline, and he had more subdivisions than what's just on the screen here. But every subdivision that he owned was restricted to people that were white or Caucasian. And to show the extent to which he specifically restricted his properties, just in these 4 subdivisions alone, in his Arden Westover, Blue Ridge, and Parkview tracts, this covered over 960 properties that were not available to anyone that wasn't white.
All right, so now we're going to go into the history of the end of restrictive covenants. In 1948, in the landmark Shelley v. Kramer Supreme Court case, they ruled that restrictive covenants in property deeds violated the equal protection provision of the 14th Amendment. However, they deemed them legally unenforceable, so they were allowed to continue. There was a decline, but we do see quite a few after 1948. And then in 1964, after over 40 cities had already passed laws banning discrimination in housing, Seattle citizens voted 2-1 against the measure, allowing it to continue. And it did not become illegal until 1968, when President Lyndon B. Johnson expanded the 1964 Civil Rights Act to prohibit discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of a house based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. And this is often referred to as the Fair Housing Act. So the path to desegregating Seattle has been a very slow one. This data from Kate Davis really demonstrates how slow the process has been. 58% of Black or white families would have to move to achieve full integration. And even now, you can see that in 2020, Black Americans are mostly moving south rather than east, north, or west. And here is the Asian American distribution in Seattle. As you can see, change has come very slowly. It was not until the 1980s that desegregation became even a little bit noticeable, and it had not made very many strides. And now in 2020, that's what it looks like.
Okay. Thank you so much. Sophia, is this a moment to go ahead and transition? Just checking with you. Okay, great. So Jaslyn, Sophia, and Nicholas, thank you so much for sharing your incredible research. And Nicholas, nothing boring about creating efficiency. That's awesome that you were able to leverage your skills and figure out how to bring, make this process as efficient as possible. So what we're going to do right now is that the moderating team actually has created a brief quiz that should pop up on your screen, and this is for all the attendees, just because these community conversations are hopefully going to be an opportunity for just learning and bringing us together to have some conversation. So you'll see these questions should be up on your screen right now. Looks like there are 3 of them. And then I think as soon as you answer, it looks like they will drop off. And in the meantime, we're going to go ahead, and I think there were some questions that came in that the moderating team were going to go ahead and pose to some of the panelists. And I know one of them is, what percent, this is a question for you, Nicholas, what % of the records are determined unreadable by the automated program?
Yeah, that's actually a wonderful question. Specifically, because we're doing deeds primarily past the 1910s, so they're mostly digital. So we're not running into any issues with like reading quality. But looking at my database right now, there's around 5 or 6 that were just flagged for some weird reason out of like 20,000. So there would be more issue with handwriting because that technology is a little bit harder to implement, but it's something that's doable. I hope that answers your question.
So thank you for that. Another question that I think you may have just spoken to this, Sophia. The question is, when did racially restricted covenants become unenforceable?
Yeah, they did not become unenforceable in the nation as a whole until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Supreme Court had already ruled them unconstitutional, but they did not make them legally enforceable. And other cities had changed their laws before 1968, but that's when they became nationally or federally enforceable.
Right, thank you. And then I think it's time for our last question before we transition. And it looks like, so this next question is, how does loan guidance differ today? And I don't know who wants to, if any of you feel equipped to take that. And I know we also, and if not, that's all right. We have a few different people who might feel like they want to jump in and speak to that.
Sophia, do you have an answer for that? And then we talk about it briefly in the next slides, but not very much.
Could you repeat the question?
Yep. How does loan guidance differ today relative to what you were describing as far as who could receive loans in the past?
I know that there is still a lot of bias and discrimination that continues to exist, but it is not written into law or written into practice in any way. And I can't really answer beyond that.
Okay. Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I think, let's see, I think we may have, and I think that was the last question we have time for before we're going to make sure we have time to transition to the next one. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I don't know if you're able to see the results of the content quiz, but appreciate everyone. Looks like lot of people found this very informative, and we're all just so grateful for your research and that you took the time to present it to us. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition us to the next piece. I don't know if some of you who joined the call a little bit later for our agenda, we now had the UW team present their research, and now we're going to transition to hearing from John L. Scott. So initiatives to address the historic presence of racially restrictive covenants are also happening in the private sector. So I'd like to introduce Monty Smith, Company Growth Officer of John L. Scott, and Chase Pennington from their legal department. So Monty and Chase are part of a John L. Scott project called Driving Change, and they are partnering with both AWS and a division inside of Amazon called Global Impact Computing that focuses on leveraging Amazon's suite of tools for public good. Monty and Chase, I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. You know, our journey on this at John L. Scott, and it was opened by, at the beginning of the presentation, was largely begun by our executives and leadership team as part of our larger DEI efforts, read or listened to and studied and discussed The Color of Law, just so that it gave us incredible insight into the past practices of the real estate and mortgage and governmental agencies that have led to the restrictive deed covenants and the CCRs. And because it was a very enlightening discussion for us, even in professionals in the industry, but it also led to, okay, but what now? You know, this was a great beginning, but we wanted to take this further. And I don't know how many people on the webinar are homeowners, but we didn't do a poll, but I'd be willing to bet the majority of you who have not actually read your deed line for line. Most people do not. And so awareness is always the first step in changing perceptions and actions. And so this led to our Driving Change project. And Chase is now going to take you through where we are at this stage of this project, how it will work, and how we hope it does lead to broader action, discussion, and movement in this area. So Chase?
Thanks, Monty, and thank you everyone for having us on today. As Monty said, this is our work in progress that we have developed along with Amazon, and piggybacking on all the great work that the University of Washington has done. They're really blazing the trail, so we would like to thank them as well. So what we have is a demo site here where a consumer, a realtor, anyone who's interested can go on and they can type in their home address just like they would in a Google search bar. And this searches the public records, and it will identify where the property is. And if any of their documents in their title chain have restrictive covenant language, we can view that language by clicking on this button, and it'll pop open their property deed, and it will highlight the language that the system has triggered that is actually being discriminatory. So in this case here, in case you can't read it, it says that any tract or any building thereon except a domestic servant actually employed by a white occupant of such lot or tract basically cannot live here. So if a homeowner saw this and they wanted to affect some change, our tool allows for an easy way to provide a modification to their title. So they would start this, and our tool would pull in the information from the public record. As I keep saying, lots of this is available on the public record, but it's a little difficult to figure out exactly, what information needs to go where. People might not know what a tax parcel number is or where to find the reference number of the exact restrictive covenant. They need to put in their legal description, and this must be perfectly exact or else you're doing it for your neighbor's house, so on and so forth. So our tool fills this in, paints by number, and just makes the form very easily for someone to submit. So if all of this looks correct, they would click here and schedule an appointment to have the modification form that was just automatically prepared notarized with a notary. And once that is notarized, they are basically done, and we will deliver the document to the appropriate county recorder on their behalf. All of this is available now in a much more longer form. And so we hope that this tool will be able to bring this to the community, start the conversation and not let red tape get in the way of doing what is right. Similarly, if someone goes to search, we'll just do this real quick. If they go to search and their property does not have any instances, that doesn't mean that that it's a true fact that there are no instances. That just means that they haven't been uncovered yet, because as the students from UW were talking about, this is an ongoing process. We're constantly discovering new stuff. So if you wanted to put your name down, your email, and your property address, we would add you to our database. And if in the future something was triggered, we'd get right to you with that prepared form, and you could go on and record your modification yourself. So that is our tool, and it is a work in progress, but we're so close to releasing it to the public, and we really hope that the communities around the greater Seattle area can find it of great use.
This is super exciting. I'm wondering too if you two could share a little bit about how all of this came about and the work that you're doing more broadly that led to this.
Well, it is, as Chase mentioned, and I'd like him to complete the answer, but it has been an incredibly collaborative effort across many aspects of the real estate industry, government, and other private industry. Our part of this discussion was also, we were involved in lobbying for the HB 1335 that was mentioned earlier, that was passed by the state legislature in March of last year, obviously being involved with the government effort. But it really was, how to automate this and make it easy for customers, homeowners, was obviously, we brought in Amazon Web Services, and Chase, you've been intimately involved in that process. So if you'd like to give a little more detail to that.
Yeah, we've come to find out that most people are very agreeable with wanting to modify these or redact these restrictive covenants. And then when you get down to the nitty gritty, it's a bunch of red tape, it's a bunch of legalese, it's a bunch of boring paperwork that must be perfect or else it won't work. So we just wanted to completely eliminate that roadblock and be able to affect more change in greater numbers and scalability.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for sharing that. That's actually, I think, perhaps a good segue to go back to our UW team, because I know you all had a little bit more to present. And one of the kind of the things that happens when we're not all able to sit in the same room is that it's harder to coordinate about who's going when. So I just wanted to actually transition back to you all so you could share a little bit more about the work that you're doing and your thoughts on exactly this, about what homeowners can do about what's in their deeds.
Yes, so that was actually a great segue. So now we're going to talk about what is being done to change the covenants. So if homeowners have, they have options if their house, deed, or property record contains a restrictive covenant. As people from John L. Scott just mentioned, you can file a restrictive covenant modification form. You can file a document with your superior court in your county to get the covenant redacted, or you don't actually have to do anything because these covenants are no longer legally enforceable, so you technically don't have to do anything if you don't want to. But we as a project encourage homeowners to file a restrictive covenant modification form rather than simply removing the covenant, and we believe this because it is important. We think it's important not to erase the history of these racial restrictive covenants because they are a historical reminder of the systems of segregation that have mapped the greater Seattle area historically and continue to do so today. In a great way to file a restrictive covenant modification form would be to use this software that John L. Scott has just created.
So discrimination has been reduced, but it has not ended. A 2011 study by the Seattle Office of Civil Rights found discriminatory behavior favoring white renters in 69% of their tests. Discrimination by lenders and mortgage insurance companies is also still prevalent, raising costs paid by homeowners of color. And where you live affects the kind of access you have to education, employment opportunities, your health, which then continues to influence wealth accumulation for people of color and perpetuates the cycle.
And the history of these practices also matters because of the wealth effect. So homeownership is the main way that Americans build family wealth. And segregation has suppressed homeownership and wealth building opportunities for people of color who have had trouble buying homes. And those who did manage to buy homes, they usually had to pay really high prices. And even as restrictions have eased, Black families are less likely to own homes. And their homes are worth less on average than white families who have been accumulating real estate wealth for generations. And another reason why wealth is important is because wealth gives people options. In the absence of income, wealth is important and often the only thing keeping people afloat.
This is a graph depicting the white and Black homeownership rates by family income in Washington state. It is from 2012. So the y-axis shows homeownership percentage and the x-axis shows family income. As you can see here, white people have a higher homeownership rate at every income level in comparison to Black Americans, Black people in the in Washington. And this is really significant because, as we previously talked about, homeownership in America is the main way to build family wealth, and lower home ownerships are a deterrent to creating wealth.
And so how can homeowners and community members help? They can first further educate themselves on the legacy and the lasting impacts of this racial residential segregation and the use of these restrictive covenants. And they can also check to see if their home contains a restrictive covenant, and if so, file a restrictive covenant modification form. And they can also volunteer to help our research team look through deeds and other property documents through a software called Zooniverse.
So because looking through these documents is so time consuming, we are looking for volunteers to help us via Zooniverse, which is a website that allows community members to get involved in real research, identify and transcribe these racial covenants from Washington state. So in a very similar project, Minnesota found over 30,000 restricted properties with the help of 6,000 volunteers on Zooniverse. And so we're hoping that with the help of people like you, we can really expedite the process of finding these restrictions. And if you want to get involved, click on that link to go to our website, click the volunteer tab and insert your email in the updates, and we will email you when Zooniverse is up and running so you can also get involved.
And just a disclaimer, these slides will be posted online, I believe, as a PDF after we're done. So you'll have access to that link that Sophia just talked about to sign up for Zooniverse. And we also put in here a slide with further reading. The first one is a link to the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project website. The second is for the Mapping Prejudice website, which is a similar project in Minnesota. And which is interesting, we work with them. The third one is an article about our research team and what we've been doing. The next two are just articles about restrictive covenants throughout the nation. And then the New York Times one is interesting. It's about a Black man who wanted to get his home appraised in Connecticut. And it was appraised for a lot less than he thought it should be. And so a couple of weeks later, he had another one scheduled, but this time he took like any reminiscence of Black culture like down out of his house, and he had his white neighbor pose as the homeowner of that house, and it was appraised for $40,000 more than it was just a few weeks earlier. So interesting. And then the last one is just more information about sundown zones. And that's all we have. Thank you.
Thank you all. We really are so grateful for you all sharing all this research and information, and all of that information. Actually, those slides are available on the city website where people registered. At this moment, since we have just 10 minutes left in our evening, I just want to ask those of you who might need to log off early, if you could please complete 2 polls to help all of the organizations that prepared and organized this evening to assess if we are being successful in our goal of bringing the community together in conversation and to plan future events. So links to those 2 polls are in the chat box. These conversations are meant to serve the needs of the community, and your feedback is invaluable. So thank you for answering those. Now I'm going to turn us to some of the questions. We're going to try and get it through as many as possible. So the first is there any research specific to Seattle showing how redlining has evolved? For example, the disparities between house evaluations where if white families get the higher price evaluation than the Black families. And I think they might mean appraisal there. That speaks a little bit. I think the example you just cited was in Connecticut, but I think this is asking about Seattle specifically. Does anyone want to take that?
I can't speak. I don't know that personally.
Right. That's okay. We have, unless there's anybody else who wants to jump in, I'm actually going to jump to a couple of others that work. Monty?
Yeah, Jennifer, it's, and it's a great question, and there are more anecdotal examples in other parts of the country, but a detailed study in terms of current market impact, specifically in, quite frankly, King County or the greater Seattle area or any particular metropolitan area, we are not aware of. But it's a great question and is certainly something that should be considered.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Monty. Question. So now that racial deed restrictions are not enforceable, why is it necessary to identify all documents with racial deed restrictions?
We as a project think it's important to recognize this history because this history is still affecting people of color today. I don't know if you remember that, the distribution map of where people were in 2020, African Americans in comparison to Asian Americans, if you can remember that back that far, Black people were still not living on the east side, in north of the CD or in West Seattle. And so it just goes to show that understanding the ways in which people of color were restricted out of thousands of properties in King County area, restricted from being able to accumulate wealth, restricted from being able to have access to schools that they may have wanted to have access to. It's a way to document the way people have been excluded in Seattle and the effects and lasting legacy of that. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think that also spoke to another question we got regarding looking at, someone remarked that the maps of Black versus Asian migration, integration in Seattle are striking between 1980 to 2020, and asking kind of what are some of the factors that contributed to that. So I think it also speaks to that question. I know that I just saw a remark that people aren't seeing the polls in the chat, and from the city, I'm seeing that these are going to have to launch at the end. So again, the purpose of those is just to help in shaping the series. So apologies that you can't yet see those. And then I'm just going to go ahead and pull one more question from the chat here. We had quite a few, and appreciate the moderation team that has been kind of consolidating these. So let's see. Let's see. As a homeowner, can you request if your deed includes any of these restricted covenants? Can you have them removed? I think that was one of the things that you all spoke to. The different ways in which that can be done, as well as people. I see another comment here asking if how people can get involved in helping, and that I think speaks to on the slide that you put up, Jaslyn, for how people can help with your projects, right? The last question is, where does Washington/Seattle stand in America in regards to redlining? Are we worse, or are there other cities or states that are worse, or is Seattle and Washington better? And maybe that's meant kind of in a historical perspective. Sophia, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. Well, redlining is a really specific process and refers to the maps created by the HOLC. And those maps were created in every single metropolitan area in the country. So pretty much every city has a history of redlining and still sees the effects. But I unfortunately can't speak to how bad it is in comparison in other cities. I just know that the effects of this segregation still exists in cities across the entire country.
And Jennifer, if I could add to that, and Sophia is absolutely right, there are no comparative studies of which we are aware, and yes, they do exist everywhere. We're actually reaching out to many other real estate brokerages and real estate organizations in other metropolitan areas around the country, sharing what we are doing. As was mentioned earlier, there are analogous efforts going on in many of these areas. But in terms of a comparative study, an overall percentage of housing stock impacted in any given metropolitan area, again, I don't think that research has been done, or if it has been, we're not aware of it.
Thank you for that. And I think that was actually a good time to go ahead and transition to our closing here. I know we have a couple of slides that our organizers are going to go ahead and put up on the screen. So as those appear, I would like to again thank everybody for attending the first event in this series of community conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion that's been sponsored by the City of Mercer Island and presented by When Am I and Do the Work Am I. We'd like to thank our partners in this work, the Mercer Island High School Black Student Union. And if you look up on your screen right now, you'll see a slide that they put together on what they hope is taken away from tonight's event. So hopefully everybody can take a look at those 3 bullets that are up there, as well as where you can go for more information. And we'd also like to thank the Stroud Joyce Community Center, the University of Washington Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, and the members of John L. Scott's Driving Initiative Change. All of you panelists who have spent your evening with us and with our community tonight, we are so grateful to you. And to everybody who joined, again, this has been a truly remarkable community turnout. Please help us ensure that these events basically achieve the goals of creating community dialogue by completing the 2 polls that are in the chat screen. So again, this event tonight is part of a broader series of events intended to help us better understand our island history and the experiences of our neighbors. So the overarching goal of the series is to encourage empathy in order to build connection and understanding across diverse identities. Additional resources about this topic, as well as information about future events in the series, can be found on the city's website, www.mercerisland.gov, Community Conversations. Thank you again for attending and for helping us work toward a more inclusive community. Good night. Appreciate you all.